In this video, we'll talk about how to build forms with HTML. We'll talk about some of the purposes of why you might want to build a form. We'll talk about the form tag. We'll talk about a variety of form controls. We'll talk about how to group elements using the field set and legend, which were introduced in HTML5. We'll talk about autocomplete, and then finally we'll build an example form. So just to give an overview of what forms are and where they fit into what we're going to be covering this semester. So forms in general allow you to collect data from your user. So anytime you need to get input, whether it's text fields, dropdowns, other sorts of things, anytime you want to get input from the user, you're going to need to build a form, which that means that your websites will have a lot of forms. They're very much fundamental to building anything where you're sending data back and forth between the server and the browser. Okay. So some examples of where you might use this, maybe you're building a registration form. If you're building a registration form, you might need things like their name, their email address, their credit card, etc. All that information would be collected together in a form. You'd also have forms if you're saying logging in or checking out, providing your credit card information. There's a lot of different places on websites where you'll find forms, including even things like, hey, I want to comment on a post, comment on a video, whatever it may be. All of those things, really, you need a form to start the process with. Okay. So when we're talking about forms, one thing we often need to do is what's called client-side validation, and that's where we validate the user input using JavaScript, and we're going to do that on the client side or in the browser. So we do that first just to make sure that the data that the user's provided to us is at least in a reasonably correct, reasonably valid state. So we'll eliminate simple errors through that, things like, hey, you were supposed to fill in a value into this field and you didn't, or hey, your email address is missing an @ sign. So we'll do a lot of simple checks through JavaScript to prevent that data from getting to the server at all, and give the user some sort of feedback to say, hey, they need to fill that in. By doing that on the client side, we take a lot of load off of the server. So rather than every time the user hits submit on the form, we're going to go ahead and check the data and tell the user about it before we even submit it. And this definitely helps with performance, and it helps with load, because then those requests don't actually even make it to the server. They don't load our server. On the other side, we always do server validation. So even if there's been validation that's been done on the front end to make sure the fields are correct, we still need to validate it again on the server side, on the back end, for security reasons. Now, typically, basically the form, the client side validation will happen first. If that passes, then we post all the data to the server, and then the application in the backend, whether that's built in Node or ASP, ASP.NET, PHP, Ruby, Flask, whatever it may be, whatever backend technology is then going to process that, do some additional validation checks, as well as then, if everything checks out there, finally do the processing that needs to happen. So, for instance, let's say you're filling out a registration form. We'll first do some validation on the browser in JavaScript to make sure it's all good. If it's all good, we'll pass that off to the server. The server will do its own validation, and that includes making sure all the required fields are in there and emails are in the right format, etc. It also generally involves things like checking that the email address is not in use by another user. That's what happens on the server side. Once all those checks pass, that's where, again, going back to the registration example, then you would actually go through the registration process. You would actually save it to the database and create your user account. Okay. So that's kind of an overview of the main parts of how forms fit together and in that process. the next thing we want to look at is how to build forms with HTML. So the first thing to talk about is the form tag itself, right? In order to have a form, you have to start and end it with an opening form tag and a closing form tag. In that form tag, it'll generally kind of be in this format. You'll generally have an ID attribute, an action attribute, and a method attribute. And we'll go through these as well as some of the other attributes here in a second that you might need. But this is the basic syntax. Now, inside of that form tag is where you're going to put all your inputs, all your drop-downs or your selects, all your buttons. Any controls that you need that actually make up the form are going to go inside of the form tag. It's worth noting if you have fields if you place your fields outside of the form, they won't be submitted. So if you want it to be submitted with that form, they do need to be inside of that form. Okay, so let's look at some of the common attributes that you might put on the form tag. So the first one is going to be the ID, and that's the ID that same ID attribute that you see everywhere in HTML. We'll typically want to add that because we'll need it in order to refer to it in JavaScript. Without that ID, typically it's impossible or it's typically not viable to get access to it, especially since as your applications get more complex, you're probably going to have more than one form on a page. So you can't just say, well, let's just give me the first form tag on the page, because that will probably end up giving you the search bar that's in the nav bar. So make sure that when you're building forms, typically they're going to need to have a unique ID that you can refer to in your code. You can do that with classes. You can have your code refer to the form via a class, and that may work better if you have things like a comment form where there's a comment form for each blog post or things like that, or each article, each tweet that's on the page. So sometimes you may use a class for that, but most of the time we'll apply an ID to the form because there's usually only one copy of that form. Next up is the action. The action is a URL, and that's where your data will be sent. So it's going to say, I'm going to send the data to that URL, and then when it actually sends it, it's actually going to redirect to that page, redirect to that URL by default. The method also is really important, and the method determines how the data is uploaded. It typically is going to be set to either get or post. Get is used for reading data. It's only if you're trying to get data that's that you're not trying to change it. Post is used for everything else. If you want to manipulate data or do any sort of processes other than just getting data or searching data, then it should be a post request. Also worth knowing, your get, when you make it as a get request, all of the fields that you put into your form will get added as part of the URL. Whereas if you have it as a post method, all the input fields, all that data will go as part of the request body and not be made part of the URL. So a lot of people like to say that post is a little bit more secure. Because it's not part of that URL. So there's definitely some security concerns where sending things via post is more secure, but there's also some performance benefits if you're doing like searching. Well, maybe you're searching for cats. Well, you're probably not the only one searching for cats. So it makes sense to do that as a get so that result can be reused. Because that's one of the things to know, get versus post. If you're making a get request, which is that result can be reused by different users. Versus with a post, you're not allowed to, the server and such is typically not allowed to reuse, server in the browser not typically allowed to reuse that result. Next up is the encryption type, encoding type. And the coding type specified as enc type, specifies how the browser actually encodes the data that it sends. That is, usually we'll leave it at its default. The one case where we'll change the enc type is typically when we're uploading files to the server. Other than that, we usually leave it the same. And then the noValidate attribute, that's just a Boolean attribute. It's either there or not there. If you add it, then it says to disable all the client validation on the form. That doesn't mean that it's not validated per se, but that means that the browser's built-in validation isn't run. It means that you can still run your own validation in JavaScript, but the browser's built-in validation won't be executed. Do know that all of these attributes are per the HTML spec. All of these are optional. They're not required, but typically you're going to add the action and the method. Should really be always things that you put into the form, because you always want to say, well, this is where I'm going to submit it, and this is how I'm going to submit it. So if you're writing a form, you should always include an action and a method. Okay, so now let's talk about some of the controls that you can put into your forms. And we'll talk about input, the input tag. We'll talk about the output tag. We'll talk about the label tag here. So first up with the input tag. The input tag is used to provide a variety of different interactive input controls. The simplest is just your text input. You can see a few examples here. If you have inputs, you're typically going to have both the ID and the name property, as well as the type and often the class. So let's look at what some of these attributes are and what they're used for. So first up is going to be the ID. IDs, again, this is HTML ID. You're going to see this on all sorts of elements. But we're going to typically need to add that to refer to it in JavaScript. So just like we added an ID to the form tag to refer to it in JavaScript, we're also going to add an ID to each of their individual controls to refer to them in JavaScript. Now, a common mistake and thing you want to know for sure, the ID is not sent to the server. Whatever value you put there is not going to make it to the server. That's simply that ID is used for our JavaScript code primarily, and maybe our CSS. The name, on the other hand, is sent to the server. The name of the control is sent to the server. Now, the ID does have to be unique in the page. The name does not. Okay, the ID of the control does have to be unique within the page. You can't have two things with the same ID, but you can have multiple things with the same name, and that's actually really common to have more than one thing with the same name. There are some cases where you have to do it that way. Third property that's used a lot is going to be the type, and the type tells you what kind of input control it is, and there's a whole long list of different input types. We'll talk about that in a minute. Fourth up is going to be the class. The class is what we're going to use for CSS styling. If you're using Bootstrap, that more than likely will be form-control. That's not entirely true of all types, so you do want to refer to the Bootstrap documentation about which class you should put in for your particular input type. But most inputs, specifically any inputs that look like a text box, like a text field, should have the class form control. It's the ones that don't look like a text box, they're going to have some other classes. Next attribute, we'll look at the value. The value provides the initial value for the control. It's not the current value. It's not what the user's currently typed in, but it's what's going to be initially filled in there when they load the page. And then finally on this list is the placeholder attribute. So placeholder provides a hint or a clue as to what you want the user to put in there. Okay, it's going to show up sort of grayed out in that field. It's a really, really helpful thing to guide your users along. But it's not a replacement for a label. All of your fields should also have a label for accessibility purposes, even if you have a placeholder text. Now, it's worth noting that placeholder text only appears as long as the field is empty. If the field is empty, you'll see the placeholder. As soon as the user starts typing in text, that will be replaced and the placeholder goes away. Some other attributes that you'll see that are not necessarily used on every field, but you'll see them a decent amount. Size, first of all, gives kind of an idea of how big the input should be. Now, typically we'll override that with some CSS, but it gives you kind of the starting point of how wide that control should be. That's measured in characters. So if I say size 20, I'm saying that this input should be big enough to accept 20 characters. Size does not mean that you have to enter that many characters, and it doesn't limit it. So if I put size 20, you can still enter 10 characters, 30 characters, 4 characters. It doesn't prevent you from force you to enter that number of characters. It's just how wide the width should be by default. The min length, on the other hand, does force the user to enter a certain number of characters at least. So if I say min length 3, the user has to type in at least 3 characters to make that field valid. Max length is on the other side. It says you can't enter any more than this number of characters. So if I say max length 5, you can't enter more than 5 characters into that field. Pattern. The pattern attribute lets you specify a regular expression that whatever the user types in has to match in order for the field to be valid. I won't go too much into that right now. That's a whole lecture in and of itself, just how to specify the pattern. But that pattern's often used for things like email addresses and phone numbers and zip codes, credit card numbers, all sorts of things that have a common pattern. The min attribute is used for either number or date inputs, and it says that the input, the value that you give can't be any less than this. So if the minimum is 3, it has to be 3 or greater. Similarly, the max specifies the maximum value, so it can't be, if you say max 10, it can't be 10. It can be 10 or less. So you often combine those two to give it a range. So I might say min 3, max 10, so that it can be any number from 3 to 10. So that works with both the min and the max work with numbers, but they also work with dates. So I can say, for instance, maybe I want you to pick a date, but I want you to pick a date from August 1st to August 20th. So I can specify that as the min and the max, and the browser will prevent the user from selecting anything outside that range. The step also is another attribute that you can use, and it will specify the increment between valid values, and that's something that you use with a number input. So for instance, if I want to say it has to be a whole number, I might say that the step is 1. So I might say the min is 3, the max is 10, and the step is 1. Versus I could say, maybe if it's a number from 0 to 100 that I want them to enter, I could say min 0, max 100, and maybe then I go in steps of 10. So that would mean that like 70 is valid, but 75 is not. It also changes how the stepper works on the number field. So it goes up and down by that step. Required, the next 4 on this list are all Boolean attributes. So required, if you add that, you're saying that this field has to have a value. It can't be left blank. By default, all of your fields are optional. The user doesn't have to enter value. But if you mark a field as required, validation will fail if the user tries to submit it without marking it required. Read-only is used to mark a field that's not editable. Marking it read-only will gray it out, but it'll still keep it in the tab order. So if the user tabs through your fields, it will still go to read-only fields. It won't skip over them. On the flip side, you can also mark fields as disabled. Fields that are disabled do appear grayed out, but they also disappear from the tab order. So if the user taps through your controls, it's going to skip over the disabled fields, but it won't skip over the read-only fields. And then finally, autofocus. Autofocus is another Boolean attribute you can apply, and that says that this control should have focus when the page is loaded. So typically you're going to put autofocus on the first control in the page so that the keyboard automatically puts focus on that first input. All right, another new tag, and this was introduced in HTML5, is the output tag. So remember we just talked about the input tag. The input tag is an empty tag. The output tag on the reverse does have a start tag and an end tag. So you're going to say here's a place where I want to put some output, some result. It might be results of a calculation, usually something that I've done with a script. So here I'm going to say this. I have this output with an ID of result, and currently you can see it's got 60 miles per hour in there. It can really contain any HTML content that you want. Output just gives you kind of a way to say semantically here I'm going to put the result of the command calculation. And then finally in our short list of controls is the label, and the label is extremely important. It's kind of the heading for each of your input and output controls. It is absolutely required for accessibility purposes. If you don't provide labels for each of your input fields, your screen readers will have a hard time trying to figure out, what's going on with your form. So make sure that all of your fields have a label. Even if they aren't visible, they need to have a label tag for screen reader purposes. Okay. Now, when you're creating your labels, there's two ways to actually add them. The most common way is to add the for attribute to say this is a label for this input. If you don't, the other way that you can specify how the label and the input are connected is by nesting them. So for instance, if we look here in this first example, I've got a label and then an input tag. You can see the input has an ID of fname and the label has for fname. So this is saying this is a label for fname. That's important to connect those two together. Also, another way you can do this, and this is helpful sometimes, especially when you're working with checkboxes or radio buttons, you can actually nest your input inside of the label. So here we've got fname, that's the input, but it's inside of the label itself. So either of these two are viable. Most of the times we'll use this first format, but things for radio buttons and checkboxes you'll typically write this way more often than not. We also will often create file upload controls using this way as well. One note about labels that a lot of people aren't necessarily aware of, but is actually really important as it turns out for certain things, is if you click on a label, it actually triggers a click event on the control that it's for. So for instance, if I have a label for a checkbox, I can click on the label and that will trigger a click event on the checkbox. Similarly with radio buttons. So that can be a really helpful thing from accessibility standpoint. Another reason why you want to make sure that these things are connected. So for instance, if I say I have a label and I have a checkbox, but I don't connect those two things, well then clicking on the label is going to do nothing. But that means I have to actually click on the tiny checkbox to make it work. Most people want to just click on the text because it's bigger, right? You get a bigger area to click on if you can click on the label instead. So let's talk about the broad variety of input controls that we have. So starting with the simplest one, let's start talking about the the text input. There's a variety of simple text, a variety of text inputs that you can use, anywhere from text to email, telephone, URLs, passwords, etc. But a single line text is just going to say, well, you can enter one line of text, one value, and it looks kind of like this. It's just a box, right? So the way that we get these different kinds of inputs, we do that by changing the type, as we kind of talked about earlier. So simple text inputs we're going to use for a broad variety of things, whether it be search boxes, names, etc. That's kind of the most common one. Now, to talk about some of these types, because text is kind of your simplest version. You say type text, it's just a single input field, and it's free form. The user can type in whatever they want. If you set the type to email, then you're saying that this is a field for an email address. So it works a lot like a text input. The difference being that it also has some built-in validation to check that it's a valid email address. So we'll do some basic validation to make sure it has things like an @sign. Also, if you change it to type email, then on touchscreens, smartphones, tablets, etc., then it will change the soft keyboard to have buttons that are better suited to typing in email addresses. So, for instance, typically on a smartphone, you'll see a little @sign and maybe a .com, an @sign to the left of the spacebar, and a .com to the right of the spacebar. Both of those things you get by changing the type of the input to email. Similarly with telephone, if you set it to TEL, you'll get a little bit of validation, and you're also, you may get a little validation, probably not much, because there's so many different ways to enter a telephone number. But you will get a telephone keypad on mobile instead of getting your regular QWERTY input. So that's really helpful for mobile users to set it to TEL if you do want them to enter a telephone number. URL, similar to the way email works. And the telephone is you'll get a different keyboard that gives you buttons that makes a different soft keyboard that makes more sense for entering URLs. Then finally on this list here is the type search. Search is for entering a single line of search strings. So you might think Google or search engine. If you've got a search box, that's a good type to use. And one of the things that it does it changes things on mobile. So on mobile, it normally would be where normally you would find the enter key or the go key. It'll change that to a search icon. So that'll either be the word search on the keyboard, or it be usually a little spyglass, depending on what version of Android and what device you're using. So there's a few other simple inputs that have some additional behavior. So for instance, password will hide the values, the characters as you type them in. Typically on desktop it'll hide all of them, but on mobile it'll usually hide all except the last one until a little bit time it goes away, and then time goes by and it'll hide all of them. Number gives you a way to kind of type in the number. It will generally, you'll only see a number keypad on mobile, but it also comes with these arrows, these stepper arrows to go up and down a step on most devices. Date, you can use that to enter a date. On Chrome, it has this kind of look. Again, it gives you a format and this calendar button that you can click to actually pick a date. Similarly, there's the time input, and that also has a specialized interface on Android and Chrome, and most other browsers have a specialized input interface for that. Date time used to be the one that we use for entering both in a single field. Nowadays, just recently, that date time input has been deprecated, so it's not really supported anymore. It was meant as a way to enter a date and time in the UTC time zone, but it had a lot of issues, so the recommendation is to not use it anymore and to switch over to datetime-local, which doesn't have a time zone associated. So it's kind of assumed that it's in the user's local time zone. So you can see it's got fields for the month and the day and the year. It's got fields for the hour and the minute, similar to kind of a combination of those two. I did this screenshot on Chrome, so you'll also see the two dashes in both of these. That's for AM or PM. And then finally, you have the calendar button to actually get the same calendar that's a similar calendar that's there. Okay. Now, if you want the user to enter more than one line of text, what you'll want to use is the text area tag. That creates like a comment box that you can enter more than one line of text. So it starts with the text area tag, ends with the text area tag. Anything you put in between there, between the start tag and the end tag, will be shown as the initial value of that field. Okay. Now, typically we're going to add the ID and the name properties just like we do with all the other fields. Also, though, with text areas, you typically want to specify how big they are. That's a definite must. So in this case, we've specified that is 10 rows tall and 50 columns wide. Make sure you specify both of those properties so that the text area gets an initial size that is appropriate to whatever you're entering. Next up, looking at radio buttons. So radio buttons will create with that type radio. Radio buttons for anything that are mutually exclusive, where the user can't pick both. It has to be one or the other. So one example might be, well, they're either female or they're male, right? There's a few more maybe nuances there, but the idea being that it's got to be one or the other. So the way that we create these radio buttons, we're going to give them type radio, but here's where they get a little bit interesting. You notice that I've, on both of these inputs, female and male, I've marked the name as gender. Okay, they both have the same name. Because they have the same name, that's how the browser determines that this is a group. So all of the radio buttons in a group actually need to have the same name. That's important. They're probably going to have different IDs, so you can refer to them in JavaScript as individual controls, but they all need to have the same name if they're in that same group. And then you also see that there's a value attribute, so value F, value M. So when you submit this form, what is actually sent to the server is this name and that value. So for instance, if I check female here, it would send to the server the value. It would send to the server gender equals F. Or if I select male, it would say gender equals M. That's how it will go through. Checkboxes are very similar. So checkboxes are created with the type checkbox. Difference being, if you'll remember right, checkboxes are not mutually exclusive. You can check as many boxes you want. They won't affect each other. With radio buttons, you remember you check one, it unchecks the other. That doesn't happen with checkboxes. So in here, I've got two checkboxes. I've actually given the same name of topping because you can have more than one topping on your pizza. So here we've got topping extra cheese, and here we've got topping pepperoni. So you can actually check both of these things, and if you do check both of them, you'll notice that, oh well, remember what I said previously, it's going to send it to the server using the name and the value. So with radio buttons, it's just that one, but with checkboxes, you can actually end up with an array of values going to the server. So when I process something like this on the server, I might view this, I might see this as an array of toppings. So topping is extra cheese, and topping is also pepperoni. So checkboxes, especially if you set them up with the same name, they may require a little bit of a different processing on the server backend. Okay. Next up is the file upload control. We get that by specifying type file. Now remember that I said previously, if you're using file upload controls, you do need to change the ENC type. We may talk about file uploads later in the course, but note that you're going to need to do a little bit of reading in order to figure out all the pieces that you need to put in place to do a file upload, because there are a few different things you have to juggle in different places to make all of this work. But one of those is to change type file. ENC type is also something you have to change on the form, encoding type. So when we have an input, probably going to have an ID, a name, your type is file. That tells it to put it here as a file you want to choose. Okay. Range sliders. So you can get a range slider like this if you want the user to pick a number, but you don't really care about exactly what that value is. If you care more about the value being exact, you should just give the user a number input. But if the user wants to kind of just guess it and say, well, it's roughly here, usually you need some sort of preview functionality to tell the user, well, this is kind of what it's going to look like. You also have to have a range. So for this range slider to work, you have to specify a min and you have to specify a max. Because you're saying the slider on the left starts at this number and on the right it ends at this number. So here I've set up a range slider. Starts at 0 on the left, goes up to 100 on the right with a step of 10. Okay, so that means as I'm dragging it left and right, it's stepping by 10. If I don't specify that 10, don't specify that step, it'll just be a floating point number. It'll be any value in between. So step with ranges is usually a good thing to kind of limit how many decimal points you get back from them picking something. And then you'll also see I've got a value. Value sets, again, just like all the other inputs, sets the initial value of that input. So initially it's going to be at 30. Okay. Another really common input type that we'll use are hidden inputs. A lot of times there's values that we need to send the server with our form, but we don't want the user to see. We don't want the user to enter them. We want them to just be hidden as part of the form. So a lot of times those are things like entity IDs, the ID of a thing in our database, or they might be things like confirmation codes. So for instance here, maybe I'm adding something to my cart, or I'm changing the price of something, of an item in my store. I might need to know the product ID if I'm working with it. So the product ID here I'm specifying as a hidden input. So you can see type int hidden. You can see the ID and the name have both been set to product ID. And then I've got a value of 30. Anytime you create a hidden input, you really should have a value attribute on it, because remember, the user can't change that value. So it's got to be a value that you've determined is going to be the value in code, because it's not a value that the user can change. Next up would be drop-down menus. So drop-down menus we create using the select attribute, which is a little bit different. So far the other ones that we've looked at have been input tags. So this one we're going to use the select tag for. So we, just like with the form input, we're going to have an ID and a name. Remember, the ID is what we use to refer to in JavaScript. The name is what was actually sent to the server. Inside of the select, we'll provide a series of option tags which provide what appears in the dropdown. Now, you can see here I've got 4 different options. The text between the start and the end tag is what the user will actually see. So the user will see the first item as -- make. dash dash, and then Buick, Ford, Volkswagen. So that's what the user will see as the text in the dropdown. On the other hand, what's actually sent to the server, and this is kind of similar to how radio buttons and checkboxes work, is actually the value. So the user sees this text, but it will try to send this value to the server. So we can see the first option is blank. And typically I want to do that with any input that I have. I want the first value in a dropdown should typically be an invalid value, namely blank like this. So that way we can make this field required, and it will give us an error if the user doesn't pick a value. So by default, if you don't say that one of these items is selected in the dropdown, it will always be the first item as being selected. So that's why the first item in the dropdown is always one that we want to be invalid. So with this value equals is blank. That's important. I've seen systems in the field where they're missing this option. If you don't have that first invalid option, you will find your users frequently incorrectly picking the first value in the list. Well, you'll get a lot of data where, oh, I just skipped over that field. I didn't realize I hadn't put a value in, and I submitted it with the first value. When I worked at like a fast food restaurant for a while, one of the things that I think was, working at Chipotle for a while, they had a problem that a lot of their employees would get hired to the first store, in the first store, because that was the first store in the list, because users didn't have to enter a value. They just kind of go through. It's like, oh, forget to set store, and then their employees would be on the payroll for the first store alphabetically in the list, or the lowest store number. You don't want that. So make sure that the first value is invalid, because otherwise it can create a lot of headaches for your users. There is, however, another way to use the select tag. So it doesn't have to be a dropdown. Typically it will be a dropdown, but you can also use it another way. If you add the multiple attribute to your select, and that will allow the user to select more than one option. So without that, as a dropdown, the user can only pick one thing. If you mark it as multiple, it'll show up like this as a list box, and the user can select more than one thing by either holding down Control or Shift, or doing a Control A to select all. So that can be a little bit more flexible if you need to have the user select more than one item. One thing worth noting, note that with a dropdown, you really should have 3 or more items in it to use a dropdown. That's the recommendation. There's a variety of different numbers. Some people might say it's 5 or more, 7 or more, but for sure, if you're going to create a dropdown, it should have at least 3 items. Don't make a dropdown with just 2 things in it, or 1 thing in it. Then you should be using a different input. Note that radio buttons and dropdowns are actually really, really similar. Both of them achieve the goal of picking one thing out of a list. What I would say is, if you have a small set of known items, known choices, then maybe at most about 5 options, then radio buttons are a decent choice. If you know them all ahead of time and there's at most 5 of them, then using a radio button might be good. But if you have more than 5, or you don't know how many of them they'll be, because it's probably data dependent on what data is in the database, I would definitely recommend using a drop down instead of radio buttons. All right, so next up is buttons. So there's a few different ways to create buttons. We can either create them with the button tag, or we can create them with the input tag. I would say that it's better to create your buttons using the button tag for a number of reasons. First of all, using the button tag allows you to actually put HTML into the content of the button. So for instance, if you want to add an icon to a button, using the button tag allows you to do that. Whereas if you're using the input tag, that's going to be, well, you're entering the text of the button as the value. You can't put HTML here. You can't put icons in using an image tag or using the I tag, using Font Awesome. You would have to set it as a background image. So using the button tag is preferred for that reason. You'll note a few of the differences here. So I've got the button in both cases. I've got the type here. If I specify the type as button, it's just a normal, generic, programmable button I can use for anything. It's worth noting the default type for button is submit, which we'll talk about in a minute. So I would say pretty much all the time with if you're using a button or if you're using an input, you should always specify the type of that input or the type of that button. So what else was I going to say? Okay, so that's your button. You can either do it as this, as using a button tag, or as an input. But I say it's better to do it as a button. Because you can put HTML in there. It also makes it easier working with it in CSS. Because if you use a button tag, then you can refer to all of the buttons, versus if you say, well, I'm going to make an input tag, well, then you have to get really fancy when you start working with your CSS, trying to style your inputs, because, well, I need to style my text inputs this way, but I need to style my buttons another way. So your CSS will start to get really complicated if you're using input type button here. So if I want to create a button that submits the form, which your form is going to need, then I need to create a button type submit. So I can either do that as an input tag, I can do that as a button tag, same way as we talked about with the previous example. I would recommend specifying that as a button tag for both of the previous reasons. One thing I do want to mention that I forgot to mention on the previous slide, you'll notice that neither of these buttons here have a name. Same way here, neither of those have a name. I would recommend against giving your buttons a name, whether you're writing as input tags or button tags, because if you give it a name, then the value of that button will be sent to the server. If you leave off the name, you don't have a name on it, it won't try to send the button text to the server. So that saves you a little bit on bandwidth and confusion in general. So don't give a name to your buttons, but if they're programmable buttons especially, you do want to give them an ID so you can refer to them in JavaScript. On the flip side, if you have a submit button, please don't add an ID or a name to that, because you should be handling a submit event on the form, not the click event on the button. Okay. So your submit buttons don't need an ID, but your regular programmable buttons do. Similarly with your reset, you can create those either as button tags or input tags, but I would recommend that you do them as button tags. The reset button, so submit button will submit all of the values in your form. That's the default behavior of it. The reset will clear out all the values in your form, all the inputs, all the selects, all the input fields, and set them back to the original value that it was when the page loaded, back to the initial value. Now, typically we do need to override the reset event a little bit with this, because one of the things that it does clear out the values, but typically one of the things it won't do is clear out any of the error messages that we're showing, or we showed with JavaScript. So we may need to override that event a bit. So reset buttons you'll do to reset the form. Okay, so let's talk about grouping fields, because at some point you're going to have a lot of fields on some of your forms. So if you just lay those out, throw those out randomly, the user is going to have some trouble figuring out, okay, well, there's 20 different inputs here. What do I do with that? So grouping fields together can be really helpful to make your forms more usable. So the two tags that we'll talk about here are the field set and the legend tag. So the field set provides a way to group your elements. So you can see here in this example how there's a box around these first four fields with the caption contact info. Secondly, this other group also has a box and a caption of address. Now, the way I create those groups is, first of all, I wrap all the fields with a field set tag, but then I add this legend. So this legend is going to be the first element within the field set. That legend is the caption that appears. So here you can see the first group, field set, all the input and labels would be here. And then you can see legend, etc. for same thing for address. So you can use field set and legend to group inputs together. All right, next up, autocomplete. So autocomplete's been around for several years, but in the past, I'd say 2 years, if I remember right, past 2 years, there's been some major change. Past few years, maybe more than two, but past few years, there's been some major changes to how autocomplete works. So it's something that you really, really, really need to understand. And once you do understand it, you'll be able to build forms that are really quick and user-friendly for your users. So they're a definite must. I mean, you can build forms without working with autocomplete, but you will find that your users have a much better experience if autocomplete is something you just always add to your forms. Okay, so first of all, why would you want to set autocomplete? So there's a few things that it's going to do for you. You'll also hear this sometimes referred to as autofill. So autocomplete, autofill. There's some slight differences to how those terms are used. Here in this lecture, I'm going to use them interchangeably though, because the HTML spec kind of does. So when we're talking about autocomplete, autofill, one of the big benefits of setting these up is that it's going to give you improved usability, like I talked about previously. It's going to make your forms much better, have a much better end user experience for your users. When you use them with your checkout, it's really going to speed up your checkout, because basically if you set it up right, then the user can just click in the first field. It'll say, oh, do you want to enter this value? And it'll enter all the values in your form. So that's really amazing. If you get it right, it can fill in the billing addresses and your name, and even your oftentimes your shipping address, your billing address. All those kind of things are really easy to do with autocomplete. It can even help you with entering credit card information efficiently. So that's really helpful. It's also helpful for users that want to register an account on your website, because those typically have a lot of fields. And especially on mobile, it can be a pain to use the soft keyboard to enter all of those things. So your users will be able to get through that process, whether it be a checkout or a registration, a whole lot quicker if you set up autocomplete. It also means if you set it up properly, you're going to find that you have fewer data entry errors. Because the users don't have to type in all the data every time, they're actually much less likely to make mistakes. Now, do be forewarned, if you do skip this process, you don't set up autocomplete, there is built-in autofill functionality in all of the browsers nowadays that will try to fill in those values. Will try to guess how it should autocomplete those fields. And if you don't help it, if you don't give it some hints about how to do it properly, it will cause problems. Your users will have some usability problems if you don't set this up. If you just don't set the autocomplete attribute on any of your fields, you will have some problems. So not only will it make your users' life better if you do, and you'll have all the benefits we talked about, you also won't have the problems that you will get without setting them up. So you really do have to, and you do really have to understand this nowadays to build forms. Okay. So there's a few different ways to implement autocomplete. And one way to do that in HTML5 now is to use this data list tag. So the data list allows us to provide a list of options. So here I have a data list with ID foods, and it's got a few different options inside of it. So I've got an apple, an orange, a burger, a hot dog, or French fries. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use this to automatically suggest values for the user to type in. So here I have a text input, which means they can really type in anything that they want. But I've added this additional property list, and I've said list is equal to foods. Now, foods refers to the ID down here, right? So I'm saying as the user types in, it will suggest one of these values as the user's typing into that. So that will provide you some autocomplete functionality. Now, that may be useful for some cases as far as giving the user some suggestions. If you have some way to kind of know what the values should be to go into that field, that can be helpful. But a lot of times we don't necessarily know what those values, what those suggestions are up ahead of time. So this is useful sometimes. More often than not, we're going to use the autocomplete attribute, though, for most fields. So the autocomplete allows us to change the autofill or autocomplete behavior for a particular input control. Originally, when it was introduced several years back, I think almost a decade now, there were only two options. It was off or on. Off saying that autocomplete was disabled for that field, on saying it was enabled for that field. You originally only had those two options. Nowadays, those options, neither of them are very well supported. Your browser will typically ignore your setting if you set it to autocomplete on or autocomplete off, has been my experience lately. So what you'll really want to do is set it to some other stuff, which a different value, which is what we'll talk about here in a moment. Even so, note that autocomplete is a suggestion. It's not a requirement. So browsers can choose to listen to the autocomplete setting that you've given, or they can decide to ignore it. They are not required to pay attention to it. Most modern browsers, including Chrome, most of the Chromium family, Chromium-based browsers will pay attention to it, but it's not guaranteed that all browsers will pay attention to your autocomplete setting, or that they'll pay attention to it in all cases. So looking at the documentation on MDN, what does this value off do? So the value off says that the browser is not permitted to automatically enter or select a value for this field. It means that the user has to type in the value. They shouldn't get a suggestion. There's a lot of reasons why you might want to set it to off, whether you're providing your own feature or because of security concerns. My experience lately, though, it's really hit or miss as to whether or not browsers listen to that setting at all. Another thing to know specifically with login forms, and this factors into registration forms as well. In most browsers nowadays, if you set the autocomplete off, That's not going to prevent a password manager, whether it be Chrome's password manager or Firefox's password manager or LastPass. Any of these won't actually necessarily, a lot of these do not listen to autocomplete off. So in order to prevent your login credentials from being filled automatically, there's generally some other things you have to do to prevent that. Okay, so autocomplete off won't work for login forms and registration forms if you want to prevent the username and the password from going in automatically. So what are some of the other things that we can set autocomplete to? Well, as per the recent spec that just came out a few years ago, there's now a standardized way and a standardized set of things that you can set autocomplete to. So I want to go through some of those. There's a very long list, so we won't hit all of them, but I want to hit the most common ones that you're probably going to run into. So first thing we can set, if we've got some fields for the user entering a name, we've got a few different values that we can set autocomplete to. If I set autocomplete to name, I'm specifying that this is the field for their full name. So for instance, for me, that would autofill as Paul Smith. The given name is then what we commonly refer to as your first name. Given name has that. The reason that they picked that is because that's more globally standard as far as what that means. Different cultures, especially Eastern cultures, whether it be India or China, order their names differently. So they don't necessarily, for them, the first name is usually the family name and the last name is usually your given name. So given name is the one that your parents give you. Your family name is the one that you're inherited from your ancestry. So when you're specifying your autocomplete, you're going to specify those as either given name or family name, not as first name or last name. Those don't actually exist as autocomplete tokens, only given name or family name. Middle name, any sort of middle name is going to show up as an additional name. So you're going to use this token, this setting for autocomplete. You're going to say autocomplete equals name, autocomplete equals given name, etc. to specify what it should fill with. Similarly, for contact information and login forms, there's another set of values. So email, if you set autocomplete email, you're saying that it should autofill the user's email address. There's also one for username. Oftentimes, email and username are almost interchangeable. But there are some slight differences. So email address usually ends with an @ followed by a domain name, whereas your username typically doesn't end with that. So for instance, when I'm looking at Google, my email would be, or Ranken, my Ranken email would be prsmith@ranken.edu, whereas my username would just be prsmith. Okay. So that's the difference between those two, between your username and your email address. Current password then refers to, well, what is the password that you currently have set. So in a normal login form, you're either going to have email plus current password if the user is logging in with their email address, or if they're logging in with just a username, it would be username and current password. Now, there's two other special tokens for autocomplete, namely the new password and the one-time code. New password is used for things like a password reset or a registration form where you want the user to create a new password. So new password says, here, don't autofill a password, suggest instead, leave it blank or suggest the user a random password to go into there. And then finally, we have the one-time code. One-time code is for things like confirmation codes, especially for like two-factor authentication. You know, sometimes when you log into different systems, whether it be Steam or Google or Facebook, sometimes they'll send you an email or a text message to say, here's the special 6-digit code, enter it on the website to prove that you're actually you. So that's what the one-time code is used for. that's important to set because you're saying, well, the browser shouldn't save that value. What you were saying is don't suggest a value here because it won't make any sense, because I'm not ever going to use a value that I used previously for one-time code, and I'm also not ever going to use this value again. So that's helpful for setting the autocomplete behavior there. Next up, talking about addresses. So you can have country. The country token specifies that this is a field for the country code. So for instance, for America, that would be US. England, that would be UK. I think Australia is AU. Japan is JA. So that's generally a 2-letter code. Whereas if you have country name as the autocomplete, you're saying that the user you want the user to enter the full name of the country. Next, parts of kind of working our way through the address. This is where address things get a little bit interesting. And remember, like I talked with the first name and the last name, when you're looking at this documentation, you have to recognize that this is for the entire world. It's meant to handle all countries with all their different cultural differences. So for instance, address level 1, that's usually what we would refer to as the street address. That's usually what we refer to as the state. Misread that. But that's considered the first administrative level. So for instance, in Switzerland, that would be the canton instead of state. That's kind of their equivalent. Or the UK, it would be the post town. So that has different meanings depending on what country you're in. But that's what we're going to use for this state. Next up, we have address level 2, which is the next level down. So for us, address level 2 is typically the city, town, or village. So for us, we would say, well, address level 1 would be Missouri, would be pre-filled with Missouri, and address level 2 would be pre-filled with like St. Louis or Belleville or such and such. Address line 1, that's your street address. And then address line 2 is kind of the second line of that street address. Now, one thing I would stress, anytime you're having an address input, please remember to have an address line 2. I know a lot of people forget to put that in there, but there are a lot of people that have a second line to their street address. It's not just one line. So like anybody that lives in an apartment, a studio, or they have a P.O. box, they're going to need to put that in as the second line. So please make sure when you're creating address inputs, have both a line 1 and a line 2, so you can really handle everybody. Finally, the postal code. Postal code is, well, that's the autocomplete token for your zip code. All right, so we talked about addresses. Let's look at what the tokens are for credit cards. So if we're working with payment instruments, it's a little bit more than credit cards, but it's typically what we use this for. So CC number, that's the token for your credit card number. CCEXP, that would be the expiration date. Now that's if your expiration date is all in one field, both the month and the year. So it's either going to be in the format mm/YY or MMYYY is usually going to be the format there. That's if it's one field. If you want to break the month and the year into 2 fields, then your year field will be CCEXP year, and your month field will be CCEXP month. CC/CSC for your security code. CC name is going to be the full name that appears on your credit card. So that's the basic fields that you need if you want to autocomplete credit card info. And if you purchased anything online recently, you'll notice that Chrome specifically and other browsers have added specific functionality to like scan a credit card, and then it will automatically fill these fields. In order for that scanning to work, you do need to set all of these autocomplete tokens. If you don't set them all properly, then it will only enter some of the fields from the credit card. Also, when you're working with payment, sometimes you may need these other ones. These are a little bit more rare. But so, for instance, we have transaction currency. That would be what currency is the transaction taking place, such as US dollars or euros and the like. Transaction amount would be how much money is being transferred in that transaction in the currency that you specified. Okay. Other autocomplete values that you might run into, language, if you're trying to select your preferred language. You may have your website is translated in a few different languages, so maybe the user has some sort of drop down to pick what their preferred language is. That's what that would be. B-day, short for birth date. If you want the user to enter their birth date as full date, that would be it. Sex is for gender. Tel for their telephone number, including the country code. URL if you want them to provide some sort of homepage or portfolio website or their company website, that would be the autocomplete token there. Photo if you want them to provide a URL to some sort of image for them or their company that they're representing. Okay, so we talked about autocomplete. We've talked about several of these pieces so far. What I want to look at is an actual example form now. All right, so here's the example form that we're going to take a peek at. So we're going to make a simple we're going to look at a simple contact form. You can find the code for this in the examples folder under called example form.html. This is along with the slides. So I'm going to close this real quick so we can go open that folder. So if you pull down the repo already, you'll go to unit 0. You'll go into examples. Go to unit 0, HTML review. There it is, examples. So that's where I want to be. Unit 0, HTML review, examples. So I can open up the example form here. Okay. So there is my example form. You can see it's got fields for the first name, last name, country, subject. I might want to go ahead and open up this in VS Code so we can actually look at the code for it. So I copy that URL, open VS Code. I'm going to go to File, Open Folder. I'm going to put in that path here that I copied. All right, so let me close everything that I have here open. All right, so on the left, we can go look at the files. I'm going to look at this file here, the example form. Now, one thing I might go over here briefly, to open up this file in your browser, you're going to right click in the file once you got it open and say open with live server. There we go. So we've got it open in the browser. So let's look at some of the code that goes into this form. Okay, so we can see that it starts with a form tag. We can see it ends with a form tag here as well. So those are paired. We can see that the action has been specified. So when this form submits, it will be submitted to action_page.php and will be submitted with the method of post, which means that all of the fields that I enter here will be sent as part of the post the request body. We can see the different fields. So here I've got a label for the first name, which is here. Pull this over a little bit. So we can see I've got the ID, the name of the field. Remember, the ID is used to refer to it in JavaScript. The name is used to send it to the server. Autocomplete provides a hint as to how to autofill the field. It's a text field because it's a name, so it's just any sort of field. You can see the placeholder is set to your first name. You can see that text appearing here. Let's look at the last name. Similarly, we've got a label, and then we've got an input that goes with it, but you'll notice that the autocomplete is set to family name. So that's what it's going to suggest. Going through the next field, we've got the label for the country, and then we've got a drop down for the country here. So the name of the field is country, the ID of the field is also country, and the autocomplete is set to country. Now remember, country is the country code, right? So if I wanted to send the entire country name, then I would need to put here country-name as the autocomplete token. But you can see here is the values. What's actually shown in the dropdown is that text. Your country, Australia, Canada, USA. We'll show you here in a minute what's actually sent to the server is going to be these values here on the left. Okay. Now, finally, we have the subject. So again, a label. And then the text area, because we want the user to enter more than one line of text. You can see that we've set it to be 80 columns and that it has 12 rows of text by default that the user can type in. And then you can see the placeholder as well. You can also use the placeholder with the text area, and that's what's appearing here. Once I start typing, you can see that the placeholder goes away. Now, with text areas, remember they support multiple lines of text, you might see this little kind of corner in the bottom right. That actually allows you to change the size of the text input. So you can actually use that to make the text input bigger or larger, but you usually want to start it at a nice user-friendly number. So the users don't have to do that most of the time. All right, so let's look at how does the autofill work here. So first of all, if I click in, you'll see that it's suggesting values. So I can actually just click in there and hit Paul Smith, and it's already picked Paul Smith USA. It's autofilled all those values because I set the autocomplete property on those. If I hadn't set the autocomplete, then it would have a much harder time figuring out what the right values are. So let's say I fill in, let's say I leave all those fields blank. I'm going to go ahead and hit submit. Okay. Now you notice that the page went ahead and changed. Let me go back here, right? So we're on example form HTML. I'm going to hit submit. Notice how the URL changes to actionpage.php. Remember, that's what we have set as the action here in the HTML. Okay. Now, one thing I can do, if I hit F12, open up the developer tools, you'll see over here, let me go into the network tab. Right now there won't be anything there because I have to open this before I go to the page. So let me go back here and submit. I'm going to clear everything out that's here. But as long as I have the network tab open, it will log all the requests that I send to the web server. So I'm going to hit submit. And it hasn't actually shown me what it went through. It went too fast. Okay, so rather than pointing that at a place where I can't see, let me point it to a place I can see. So I'm going to point it, tell it to submit it to itself. So here, let's change this to example form.html. Okay, so I'm going to change that real quick here. Refresh it here. Now when I submit it, did I not save? Oh, it's still going through as a post request. So maybe I need to do it this way. Let's send it as a GET request. There's what I want to see. So if I send it without putting any values in and I've sent it as a GET request, I can look in the network tab. I can see some of these things. I can also see it in the URL where it's set fname, lname, etc., country. But you can see each of these values are being set to blank because I didn't fill anything in. So the typical format that you're going to see here, you can see the end of the page, the end of the file starts with a question mark. So that's the separation between the file name and the fields, the values. So you can see fname is equal to blah, lname is equal to blah, and each of these different key value pairs are separated with amps. So that's kind of how you read the query string. So let's actually put some values in here. Okay, so I'm going to say Paul Smith, USA, my message. Now that I put those values in, we can see it here. So fname is Paul, lname is Smith, country is US, and the subject is my message. Now you'll notice that there's a little plus here. When it gets encoded and put as part of the URL, what it's doing is it's replacing spaces with plus signs. So that's what you can see there. If you send it as a GET request, you'll be able to see it there. If you send it as a POST request, it wasn't working for me here, but typically what you'll see it down here, which actually it is showing them down here. So if you're looking for the values that it actually sent to the server, oftentimes you'll want to scroll down here, whether it's a GET request or a POST request, and you'll see these values. So you can see fname is Paul, lname is Smith, country US, subject my message. So remember, all of that came from these names and the values. That's where those things come from. And we can see that what's sent is US, even though what I had is USA. All right, so that's the end of the ad example there. Go back to the slides. Oh, no, I need to go back up here. Oh, I already have them open. Okay. So that's the slide that we were at. So we looked at that example form, and just to kind of summarize some of the things we've looked at today, we looked at part of the purpose. We talked about part of the purpose of why you might use a form. Remember, a form comes in anytime you want to get input from the user. Anytime you're going to get input from the user, you're going to use a form. So that login forms, registration forms, check purchase, if you're going to check out, buy something, a lot of those are all places that you'll see forms, or commenting, etc. And we'll need them. They're a core part of being able to send data to the server. So we'll use those a lot to send data from what we call the front end, the HTML, to the back end, which is where our Node database is going to live. In order to create a form, remember, you need to start and end it with the form tag. That needs to wrap all of your form inputs. So most of those you'll create with the input tag. Some of those you'll create with the select tag for dropdowns, and other ones of that you'll create as, if you have a text area, you'll use text area tag. Remember, each of those, for accessibility purposes, each input needs to have a label. Otherwise, screen readers will have a problem. You can group elements together using the field set and the legend tags. Remember, field set creates kind of a box, and legend gives a caption to that box. We also talked about how to use autocomplete to change the behavior of autofill, and that's a definite must for registration forms and checkout forms, to speed up the user's process and improve readability, improve usability. But it also, if you do it right, will actually prevent a lot of common errors. And then finally, we looked at a simple example form, contact form. There are a few useful links here that you can kind of follow through, give you some more give you some more reading material about some of the things we talked about today. But that's it for this lecture. I will see you again tomorrow. All right. Thank you.